So we've had all these discussions. Now I just want to talk to you about different flavors of filtration. And for the ease of demonstration, and because they're so big, I figured the 4x4 cut glass would be the easiest thing for us to look at together in a video presentation. So I have right now a set of 4x4-inch cut glass filters. Now, we just installed our matte box on the Sony FS5. This matte box is for 4x4 cut glass filters. Now, if we happen to get filters of larger sizes, like 4 by 6.5 inches, for instance, which is more rectangular than a 4x4 filter, then we'll have to jump from this matte box to one that I have here. And this one is a 4x5. For short, we call it a 4x5 matte box, even though we know that it's 4 by 5.6.5. It's just easier to say 4x5 really quick on set. But we'll show you the 4x5, and it's interesting because it has a feature called a swing-away hinge, where this one mounted to the iris rods on our base plate rig, and mounted with a threaded flange adapter, a flared adapter, so that everything was a solid build. This one will swing away and give you access to your filters and your lens for doing lens changes really quickly on set. So we'll talk about 4x5 glass in a moment. Right now, I just want to show you some different styles of 4x4 cut glass and show you how to install them into the matte box. So we talked about shooting at beautiful downtown Lake Eola Park yesterday, and the fact that we used the Paradise Blue graduated filter. Paradise Blue is a really subtle color effect, so we may not see much of it on the video, but I'll show you what the filter looks like just for the sake of demonstration. And I'll use my white card to help you get some sense of the graduated effect. You might be able to see it here. It's a very thin, subtle Paradise Blue at the top, and it graduates down to zero density clear glass at the bottom of the filter. So this is to sort of re-inject a little bit of blue color to our sky. If we're shooting outside and our exposure is blowing out the value of our blue sky, we can put a little blue back in the sky in camera with a Paradise Blue grad. Here's another really pretty filter. And I think that you folks will recognize this right away, or maybe you won't. I'm a child of the 70s and 80s. You guys may remember a film called Top Gun, and you may remember Tom Cruise in fighter jets, and you may remember those beautiful shots on the deck of the aircraft carrier at sunrise. Well, there's the Bruckheimer filter right there. This is called a Coral Grad, and this one is a Coral Grad number 3, so it's a density 3 Coral Grad. We'll get into that in a separate video about the different variations on these filters. But a number 3 Coral Grad is a very dense coral color. While the Paradise Blue is a very subtle blue grad, the Coral number 3 is a heavier effect. So you wouldn't want to use this on everything. Occasionally, it's a very pretty effect when used correctly. And the thing to remember about a Coral Grad, or any grad for that matter, is that it does put a line of delineation in your frame. So anywhere where the graduated effect is happening, if you have a subject, for instance, walk into the foreground, they may end up with some of that grad covering their head and shoulders. And that would be a bad thing, because all of a sudden we see the filter effect revealed for what it is, a mechanical effect. So you only want to use this on wider shots, vistas, things where, skylines, for instance, or just really wide establishing shots where you can put all of your foreground elements cleanly in the clear area and make sure that only your background, extreme background, and sky elements are inside of your grad effect. Just keep that in mind when using graduated filters. So this is a Coral number 3. What else have we got here in graduated filters? Here's a chocolate grad. This is a chocolate number 1 in 4x4. And this is a nice filter as well. If you're doing something like, let's say we talk about The Godfather a little bit, don't we, in some of our tutorials. Well, here's a chocolate grad, and this is a chocolate #1, so it's a very subtle chocolate effect. Okay, if a #3 was a 75% coral effect, a #1 is about a 25% coral effect, or maybe a quarter value effect. But you can see it puts a nice sort of sepia value in the upper frame, and again it leaves the lower frame clear. So if you're trying to age your establishing shots a little bit, make them look a little bit like a period film, a chocolate grad might be the filter for you. Again, use it only on your wide stuff and try to avoid prominent foreground images that will intersect with your line of delineation. Okay, so those are the grads. Interesting, valuable tool, not for everyday use, but the right tool for the right job. When you need it, a grad can save your bacon. What else have we got here? We talked about our neutral density. Here's a polarizer. A polarizer is great for removing glare from shiny surfaces like glass, car windows, the surfaces of bodies of water like ponds, rivers, streams, lakes, the ocean, if you can get it calm enough. A polarizer basically takes away reflections. If you can think about a reflection as a diffusion effect, in essence, what's happening is when light reflects off a surface, it bounces in a resulting vector called a reflection. And if you have enough light rays bouncing off of a surface and maybe coming from different sources, you start getting this sort of minutia of resulting bounce vectors. And all of that confusion creates a softness or a glare that we associate with reflections or haze or ghosting or sometimes flares in the lens. And a lot of that can be reduced with the use of a polarizer. This happens to be a cut glass polarizer, and therefore it's a linear polarizer, meaning the polarization effect is happening only in straight lines. And what this filter is designed to do is take all of those mixed angles of incidence of light rays entering the lens and doing what we call rectifying all of those vectors into straight lines that go straight into the lens without reflection, and therefore reduce diffusion, reduce glare, and reduce the artifacts of reflection on shiny surfaces. And in order to see the effect of a polarizer, what you need to do is rotate it so that the light entering the filter and then the light hitting your recording sensor will be affected by the opposing lines of neutral density that are inside the glass. If you could look at this under a microscope, you would see intersecting lines of neutral density, and as you move them together or as you turn them, you see the reduction or the increase of reflection on your resulting image. That's a linear polarizer. A circular polarizer has the effect in the glass in concentric patterns to accommodate autofocus systems like on our GH4, GH5, for instance, or on your FS5 if you're using it in autofocus. But we don't really like autofocus in motion pictures, do we? We like to have our focus puller or our camera assistant perform that for us. So linear polarizer is the way to go, and then you just turn it in the filter stage of your matte box in order to see the effect materialize on your monitor. And to do that, as we did with our optical flat, we're going to pull a stage out here. And this is our optical flat. I'm going to pop it out of the frame and add my polarizer. This one's tight. Well, maybe we'll use this filter tray. Loosen the lockdown. I don't know if you can see that, but I'm just loosening that little knob. And we'll put our polarizer in the back. So we drop it into the filter frame like so. And we just open the little trap and close it down so it holds our filter in the filter tray. And then I'm going to put it in the back slot of our matte box, like so. And I'm going to feel for it to indent so I know it's in all the way. And now I can put my optical flat back in the front. And in order to affect the change on the polarizer, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to rotate the stage on the matte box until the desired effect appears on the monitor. And then I'm going to leave that in the position that worked best for camera. And then, of course, the front stage has my other filter in it, my optical flat. So this is a loaded matte box at this point. We got the polarizer in the back, closest to the actual lens, and the clear optical flat overall as protection for everything behind it. Okay? So that's a polarizer. And what else have we got here? Here's a 0.5 cc magenta filter. Earlier I discussed with you shooting under fluorescent lights, and I showed you a round threaded fluorescent filter. Here is a half myrid value CC filter in magenta, full magenta. So it's magenta from corner to corner, top to bottom. And all this does is filter out a little bit of the green contamination from industrial overhead fluorescence. Okay, this is a 0.5 magenta filter, and they come in values all the way up to magenta number 3. If you can find them, they're kind of rare, but you can find them out there. This is a magenta correction filter. What else have we got over here? Diffusion. Diffusion is a really popular form of filtration, and here's a little secret about diffusion that not a lot of people realize until they've tried it in post. Diffusion is one of the hardest things to affect in post-production. Diffusion is an organic response to the available light that you're shooting under and the grade of filtration that you have selected. Here's a half white pro mist, for instance. Now, if any of you have ever seen movies like, say, Legend with Tom Cruise, the white pro mist was something that those folks used quite a bit. I don't know if you're going to see properly in front of my white card what a diffusing filter does, but if I hold the black filter wallet behind it, I think you can see that this filter has a smoky or frosted quality to it. So when you put this in front of the lens, it's going to give everything that diffused or slightly out of focus look. Fine details with a white pro mist will stay sharp if your image has been focused properly, but highlights, reflections on shiny surfaces, windows on interiors, if you've ever seen anything by Stanley Kubrick, like Barry Lyndon, for instance, where they shoot a lot of interiors and the windows are all blown out and the values are white, but they have this haze around them. That's white pro mist, okay? It's a very interesting filter. It's kind of dreamy. Some cinematographers will use this filter when they're trying to suggest the idea of a flashback. If you've ever seen the film Somewhere in Time with Christopher Reeve, they use a lot of white pro mist there whenever he goes back in time to meet with the female hero of the film. And when he's in present day, everything is clear and unfiltered, and then they use the half white pro mist or the full white pro mist to indicate the times when he has gone back in time to visit upstate New York and the theater where the film takes place. What else have we got here? Neutral density is something that we talked about, and we talked about shooting outside with internal neutral density. And if that's not enough, this camera, for instance, has a native ISO value of, at the very minimum, 1000 ISO, 1600 ISO on mid-gain, and 3200 ISO when you shoot in S-Log. So if you're dealing with ISOs that are that high, sometimes the internal ND is not enough if you want to shoot at f-stops that are going to give you theatrical depth of field. I mean, if you want to shoot at T16, yeah, you can use the internal neutral density. But we don't really shoot at T16 for motion pictures. We don't even really use 8 or 11 either. The most, if we're shooting anamorphic, we're shooting widescreen at a 4 or 5/6 T-stop. And usually with spherical lenses and 16:9 format for television, or 1.85 for spherical theatrical presentation, we're going to be around a working f-stop of a 2 to a 2.8.5, 4.5 at the extreme outside. So we need neutral density. And the thing about neutral density is sometimes in-camera neutral density will give you digital artifacts because it's using, again, opposing vellums of ND to reduce reflection and to add or to build exposure value inside the camera. And sometimes you can get digital artifacts, either vignetting or what we call the bow tie effect, where parts of the frame have been vignetted by opposing plates of neutral density. And so cut glass neutral density in a matte box is the best way to go. It offers the least amount of artifacting, and it's pretty much just as easy to use as the in-camera stuff. This is an ND3, so you can see it's a very subtle gray value. This is a one-stop reduction in exposure, ND3. I also have it in ND6 and ND9, so we can go with ND3 at one-stop reduction in exposure value, or I can go N6 at 2 stops reduction in exposure value, or N9, 3 stops reduction in exposure value. And I think Tiffin, even now, is starting to produce ND 1.2, which is a 4-stop reduction in exposure value, versus the clean exposure without the neutral density filter. So these are really handy, and because they're flat cut glass instead of electronic, there's no artifacting here. You can turn it in the matte box. You can do anything that you have to do because all it is straight up ND. So these are nice filters to have in your filter box as well. They'll save your bacon a lot. You can use these with autofocus systems because it's just neutral density. And you can use these with extreme wide-angle lenses. A lot of you may have discovered that the variable neutral density filters are a pretty handy tool. And I grant you, they are. However, what will happen with a variable neutral density filter is on a particularly wide-angle lens is it will vignette in the corners because it's using opposing values of neutral density across each other to create or subtract exposure reduction. And when it does that, it vignettes in the corners. I've got a variable ND filter in here somewhere to show you. Here it is. It's kind of like the polarizer, that it has a ring to attach to the lens, and then it has an outer ring that you turn to increase or decrease the effect. And on the outside of the filter, you can see that it has etchings that describe the value of neutral density that you're dialing in and out of this filter. And this filter has a, let's see what it says here, slim filter factor ND, 77 millimeter, minimum and maximum. It doesn't define a ratio here, but I think this is something like a 12:1 filter factor, which brings me to a very good point. Filter factor. Filter factor means that with any given exposure, when you apply a filter to the camera, you have to consider the exposure correction that needs to happen when you're using that filter. We talked about the ND filters being 1 and 2 stop reduction, And most of these filters will have a filter factor attached to them. Color correction and diffusion are generally very minimal. If you put them on the camera and you check your exposure, with diffusion you may not see any reduction at all. With a color correction filter, you may see a reduction of 1/3 of a stop or 2/3 of a stop. If I take my light meter and I set my ISO to something workable here, like 800 ISO, and I check and see what my key light is doing, I see that I have just about a T4 happening here. Let's see. There it is. There's T4 right there. Now if I put the, what is this, a half white pro mist in front, and I take another reading, yeah, this cut it down 1/3 of a stop. So what do you know? Even a half white pro mist has a filter factor of 1/3 of a stop. So if your exposure was 24 frames a second, 1/48 of a second shutter, native shutter speed, and we were shooting at a T4, and we put this diffusion filter in front of the lens, we could open up to a 2/8 2/3 on the lens to accommodate the filter, or we could let it ride. 1/3 of a stop is pretty forgivable, and we can correct that in post. But sometimes we want to be specific about the factor of correction and make sure we dial it in to compensate. That's particularly important with color correction, because they're going to represent a deeper f-stop of correction, 2/3 of a stop, and that can be a noticeable error in exposure calculation on certain things like close-up shots in dramatic narrative style shooting, for instance. Sometimes 2/3 of a stop can make or break the look of your key light on your heroine or your hero at a critical moment in filming. So we want to make sure that we know what the filter factors are and make sure we take those exposure compensations probably on the lens. That's the easiest place to do it, or with your ISO. If you need to keep your T-stop at a specific number for some reason, like critical depth of field, maybe you don't want to adjust your lens f-stop to accommodate the filter, you can change your frame rate, you can change your ISO, and you can use neutral density. So all of those different ways of adjusting your exposure to accommodate for filter factor. So I've shown you 4x4 cut glass. I have another matte box here. I just wanted to show you if you end up with the 4x5.65 filter like we talked about earlier, it's not going to fit in our 4x4 matte box. So we're going to pull out something like the Red Rock Micro matte box, and I got a little time. Why don't I throw it on the camera for you really quick and let you check out what this looks like. I'm going to take off my 4x4, and to do that, I'm going to loosen the drag lock on the bottom, which attaches the box to the iris rods, and then I'm going to flip up this little tab here in the back to release the flared adapter that's on the lens, and the whole unit just slides right off the iris rods. I'm just going to lay this over here for now. And I guess I'll take this flare off here. Since I'm not using the 4x4 matte box, I'll take the flare that goes with it and I'll keep it with the 4x4 matte box. That way, all the parts for that particular piece of gear stay together. Maybe the B camera has to run off and do some second unit work somewhere. They take the 4x4 matte box, but they forgot the flared adapter because I still had it on my lens. They get to the location and they can't lock the matte box onto their iris rods and lens properly. So when you don't use if you're done using a piece of gear, when I put it back on the camera cart or in the camera staging area, I make sure that all the components go with it so that if somebody else needs to use that piece of gear, they have a complete kit and they don't have to worry about leaving something behind. Having said that, let's attach our 4x5 matte box. Now, this attaches a little bit differently. It rides on rods that are oriented 90 degrees to our traditional 15 millimeter iris rod bed, which is down here at the bottom of the lens. But what it has is accommodation for our under the lens iris rods here, and then this L bracket, which attaches the whole device to the camera. And we attach this puppy like so. This probably has another drag lock down there. There we go. Whoop. Let's pull that like that. And that's about it. That's as far as that's going to go. This lens is a little undersized for this matte box. This matte box is basically for cinema zooms or very large primes like our 85 millimeter here. In fact, let's do that. Let's just show you what that looks like. I can swing this matte box out by pulling up on this little locking knob, and that whole deal slides right out like that. So when I'm doing lens changes on set, I can just swing my matte box out of the way, and I think you can see right away the difference between this matte box and the 4x4, which I would have had to loosen up and extract from the rig in a couple of different points. This one, you just rock that whole matte box out of the way. I push my indent, release my lens, take my zoom lens right off. I'm probably going to have to readjust my follow focus, so I'm just going to pull it right off for the moment. Set that over here. And let's install the Zine 85 millimeter Cinema Prime, like so. Red dot to red dot on the camera. Oops, forgot my adapter. That's still over here on my Tokina lens. Okay, now we can put our Cinema Prime in place. This is a Canon mount, by the way. And I get Canon mount on all of my cinema stuff because it's the most common mount that's available, and I can adapt it to any camera. So here's now our 85 mil, and oh yeah, that fits real good. And we have this donut here. In fact, probably should put that on first. We got this donut here to block any light that comes in from behind the matte box and keeps that stray light from reflecting off the back side of our cut glass filters, and eliminates reflections that enter the matte box from weird angles. And when we close it all up, we get a nice light, tight fit. And here's our 4x5.6 matte box. And you can see it's quite a bit larger than the rest of my 4x4 accessories. But it works the same way. We have rotating filter trays for polarizers and for graduated filters. We have 2 trays, and we have lockdown or tightening screws here on the side that allow us to pull our trays up. We have a nice latch here that allows us to attach our 4x5 filters to the camera, and they slide in and indent just like the 4x4 matte box. So if you have our larger filters, for instance, here's a diffusion filter. This is called a 4x5 Classic Soft. This is another diffusion style filter. This is a very subtle grade of diffusion. This is what we would call a cosmetic diffusion filter. If you're doing close-ups of female talent on a movie, let's say like Keira Knightley in Atonement, we have a lot of those dreamy images of her with her lover at the fountain, and in flashback scenes in London during the World War. A lot of that was done with filters like Classic Soft. It puts a real creamy, dreamy patina on your images, and it flatters the female star immensely, and creates a really pretty picture. So let's pop this, pop this guy in here, and it looks like it's Some of these are a little thick. I think that's okay. Let's pop that in there, like so. Oop. It's a little tight. There we go. Slide that right down in place, and our classic soft is loaded in the matte box and ready to go. Quick pointer, whenever you use filters in a matte box like this, pro tip, what we used to like to do is take 1-inch white camera tape, make a little tab about so long, 1.5 inches, 2 inches long, put it right on the side of the matte box, and with black Sharpie, write on there what filters in your matte box. And for the camera assistant who's got a lot on their mind, they're taking focus measurements, they're pulling focus, they're moving the camera, making sure they don't leave their gear bag behind from one set to the other. They might leave a filter in the matte box and forget about it. You don't want to start filming the next scene and get halfway through your coverage and realize, oh gosh, I still have the classic soft in here from the last scene and I really didn't need it for this night exterior, and that's a problem. So we just put a little tab of tape here, a little label to let us know there's something still in the box, and we pull the filter, put it back in its protective wallet, pull the tab, and maybe we save it on the back side of our slate or somewhere where we can reuse it, and then we maybe put another label on the matte box that says clean, and that indicates that none of the trays are loaded with filtration. So that's cut filters, that's filtration with the Sony FS5. I hope you enjoyed this discussion. Obviously, there's a great deal more we could say about filters, but for now, this has been a quick cursory look at filtration. I hope you enjoyed it, and join us again when we talk about cinema primes and we talk about focal length and rhythm, pace, and tone using cinema glass. So take it easy, enjoy this video, and I'll talk to you again soon.